When I first started hearing conservatives talk about immigration, I honestly thought they were just being cold hearted. People who didn't care about suffering or poverty. But over time, I realized that wasn't entirely true. And that hit me hard because I always believed compassion and common sense should go hand in hand. Somewhere along the way, the left stopped believing that. And once that happened, reason started sounding like cruelty. Whenever someone on the right raised concerns about mass migration, I kept hearing the same points over and over. And the more I listened, the more I realized they weren't coming from hate, but from practicality. People would say things like, half the world lives in poverty or different circumstances. That doesn't mean everyone has the right to come to the United States. Every other country protects its borders. Why can't we? And another one that stuck with me. Mass migration isn't sustainable. If people come here who don't share our values or who don't want to assimilate, it can destroy the very culture that made this country what it is. I think a YouTuber named Brandon Lehman said that. Anyway, what he said makes sense because people around the world don't all share the same values. Some directly conflict with the ones we hold here. And if people come without any intention of integrating, without any respect for the laws and traditions that make this country stable, that's not unity, it's chaos. But instead of engaging with those concerns, the left would usually go straight to guilt. The arguments I heard most was that America stole the land in the first place, so we have no right to restrict who comes here. That logic sounds deep until you actually think about it. If you carry it to its conclusion, then no one in the entire world owns the land they live on because every piece of land was conquered at some point in history. If that's the rule, then no one has a home, no one has borders, and no one has a country. That's when it hit me. These debates weren't really about fairness, they were about emotional manipulation. It became easy for the left to group anyone on the right under one ugly label. All it took was a few people saying truly racist things to color the perception of the entire movement. So if anyone else said something even remotely similar, even if it was true or based on a legitimate concern, it was automatically dismissed as racism. That's how honest conversations die. One extremist says something hateful, and suddenly anyone who notices the same problem is treated as if they share the same motives. The left stopped separating intent from association, and that made it impossible to talk about complex issues without being accused of bigotry. In reality, a racist and a realist can sometimes describe the same situation, but for completely different reasons. The difference is in the motive. One is driven by hate and the other by concern. But the left stopped caring about that distinction. They just blurred everyone together. And I still believe in tolerance and cultural diversity. I always have. But somewhere along the way, the left turned those ideas into something sacred. Something you're not even allowed to question. It stopped being about respect and became almost like a moral religion. And when ideology turns into religion, people stop thinking critically. They become afraid to acknowledge real threats or talk about uncomfortable truths, not because they don't see them, but because they're terrified of being called hateful. So take Islamist extremism, for example. It's not Islamophobia to acknowledge that groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Muslim Brotherhood are actively working to restore a global caliphate. That's their own stated goal. We've seen the consequences of this kind of ideology in places like the United Kingdom, where figures such as Ajim Kodare were allowed to preach extremist ideas for years under the banner of free speech, and where police looked the other way in grooming gang scandals because they were afraid of being labeled racist. And some of the people warning us the loudest aren't on the right at all. They were reformers and critics who grew up inside Muslim majority societies themselves. People like Ayan Hirsi Ali and Majid Nawaz and others who risked their lives to speak out about what happens when a society confuses tolerance with surrender. The left became so focused on being tolerant, open minded, and inclusive that it stopped standing up for its own values, safety, or identity. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has warned for years that Islam, in its most political and authoritarian form, can't coexist with Western freedom, not because of ordinary Muslims, but because of the extremist ideology that refuses to. And she's right. The extremists within both worlds, the West and the Islamic world, are like oil and vinegar. They just don't mix. Coexistence can only happen with both sides are willing to compromise. But compromise is impossible when the other side is determined to dominate. Most Muslims would never dream of doing what the extremists did on September 11th. Yet, it only took a few to bring down the towers and to shake the entire world. That tragedy showed how powerful even a small number of fanatics can be when society refuses to recognize the danger early on. So when people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Majid Nawaz warn that blind tolerance can lead to self-destruction, they're not being hateful. They're being honest. They're trying to stop the same mistakes from happening again. And that's the thing about the left. Somewhere along the way, they abandoned honesty and replaced it with something that can't be sustained. Something that sounds compassionate, but ultimately erodes the foundation of any society that takes it seriously. And I couldn't follow them down that path. I wasn't willing to trade truth or comfort or self-preservation for political correctness. And that is why I'm politically homeless now. I didn't leave my party because I wanted to belong somewhere else. I left because I couldn't keep pretending that this was normal. I couldn't keep pretending ideas that would in time destroy the very country that made me free enough to believe them in the first place. I don't have a political home anymore, and maybe that's okay because sometimes standing alone is the only way to stay honest. Tolerance and empathy are good things, but they can't replace the truth. If you silence honest discussion out of fear or offending someone, you're not being moral. You're just being naive, and that kind of wishful thinking can destroy a nation from within. We should have never reached a point where waving the American flag is called racist, or where defending America's right to protect its borders is seen as bigotry. No other country in the world is expected to hate itself for existing. That's only the US. That kind of mindset isn't sustainable. It's an alternate reality that ignores history, ignores human nature, and ignores the balance between compassion and self-preservation. What's especially ironic is that not long ago, both parties agreed illegal immigration was wrong. The Democrats' stance wasn't that illegal immigrants should stay, it was that immigration laws needed reform, so more people could come legally. The idea that illegal border crossers deserve legal status is a brand new position. You don't even have to go far back to see it. In 1995, Bill Clinton said, quote, Americans were rightly disturbed by the large numbers of illegal aliens entering our country and promised stronger border enforcement. In 1996, he signed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which increased deportations and penalties for illegal entry. Even when Barack Obama said in 2005, quote, we simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, and unchecked. And during his presidency, Obama deported record numbers of people, which still calling for expanded legal immigration. That used to be the Democratic position. Reform the laws but enforce the border. The big shift came after 2012 with DACA and then during the 2020 primaries, when major Democratic candidates started pushing to decriminalize illegal border crossings. That's when the party's message changed. Defending illegal immigrants as a group became mainstream, something that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. And then there came the double standard. When Trump made deportation a focus, the media acted like it was a humanitarian disaster. But deportations had already been happening under Obama, and they continued under Biden. In many cases, it was the exact same list of people who had already gone through the courts, lost their appeals, and refused to leave. The difference wasn't what Trump did, it was who did it. And that's when I realized this whole thing wasn't about compassion anymore, it was about control. Because if something is evil when your opponent does it, but necessary when your side does it, then you're not fighting for justice, you're fighting for power. From my perspective, I've always supported immigration reform. I still do. I believe people should have a legal way to come here and build a better life. But I supported that under one condition, that our borders would be secure and people would be properly vetted. That's not what happened. Reform became a loophole. The borders stayed porous. The system fell apart. And when I saw how differently people reacted depending on who was in office, how the exact same policies were either celebrated or condemned based on the political jersey, I realized the compassion wasn't real. It was conditional. Conditional on power, conditional on votes, conditional on who could be blamed. That's when it hit me that I hadn't changed. The party had. I still care about fairness, safety, and humanity. But the left started pretending those things couldn't exist together. And when you have to abandon truth to protect your politics, it's not politics anymore, it's ideology. Leaving the left wasn't about switching teams. It was about realizing that truth matters more than loyalty, and that compassion without honesty eventually becomes cruelty. Because a system that can't tell the difference between mercy and manipulation isn't moral, it's broken. And that's when I knew I couldn't defend it anymore. This was just one part of why I left the left, but it was the start of everything because once you notice the manipulation, you can't unsee it. And when you finally stop repeating their lines and start thinking for yourself, you realize that leaving isn't about hate or anger, it's about clarity. It's about finally being free to call things what they really are.